Thank you, Abhijit, for the nice intro. I hope all of you see the screen. The screen, it should just look like one big piece of PPT. I hope you don't see any black spots or anything like that on the screen. So if that's the case, if everything is looking good, I'll just move forward. I'll switch on the pointer. I have two screens, so sometimes I have some problems. So let's just go ahead. I'm talking about uses of machine learning in the subsurface characterization world. And my goal is to share 4 case studies today. Uh, and again, when I'm sharing 4 case studies, I won't have time to jump deep into each of them. I have 45 minutes. I won't take more than 45 minutes. After each case study, I'll stop and I'll try to interact because we have a smaller audience. It's better that we can interact and keep everybody engaged. So why are we doing data-driven models right now? Why is there so much of emphasis? Most of you already know it's a combination of 3 things: computation power, deployment of sensors, a lot of different types of sensors, and massive storage, right? So those 3 have led to this data-driven revolution. We develop a lot of different models. Now, if you look over here, these are some of the popular use cases of the 3 most popular branches of machine learning: unsupervised, supervised, and reinforcement. These are 3 more popular versions. I'm spending a lot of time on reinforcement learning these days and on unsupervised learning. To me, from a research point of view, supervised learning is relatively easy. You have an X, you have a Y, you try to relate them. And the biggest challenge in supervised learning is feature extraction. You have to design good features. In oil and gas world, the kind of data sets that I encounter, the quality is low, the quantity is low. So I cannot use a lot of neural networks. Because I don't use a lot of neural networks, I have to design features on my own. And once I design the features, they become the X, and then I relate it to Y. So supervised learning is relatively straightforward. The most important thing is feature extraction. Uh, that's my experience with supervised learning. I'm spending a lot of time on unsupervised and reinforcement learning. So the beauty of unsupervised learning is that's where we as domain people, we as geoscientists, geophysicists, petroleum engineers, subsurface engineers, we can really shine. Because when we apply unsupervised learning, we don't have any outcome. We don't know what we'll get. So we need a lot of interpretation. We need a lot of physics-based understanding of what these methods are generating. So so in this particular talk, I think I have one case study about unsupervised learning, and I'll tell you how it has helped. And I think for us as domain people, unsupervised learning will be really useful. The main objective of using unsupervised learning is to generate insight from large amounts of data. Now, when we come to this 4th one, there's a spelling mistake here, reinforcement learning. The most important thing of reinforcement learning is to control. We want to control natural processes or some system. So anytime we want to control, we need to use reinforcement learning. I've seen use of reinforcement learning in automating discovery. Scientific discovery. I'm spending some time on reinforcement learning these days. In today's talk, I don't have any example of reinforcement learning. All these use cases that you see outside, these are mostly in the commercial side of things. So you can pick some of these commercial applications and try to use it for subsurface world if you want. Now, one thing that I've learned from 7 years of spending time in machine learning, I have summarized everything in this slide. So the first thing is, when should you use data-driven models of machine learning? When you don't have a simple rule-based approach, or you don't have some algorithmic procedure. So when you don't know how to do a particular task, when you don't have a first-order model, then you have no other option but to learn from the data. So that's when you use data-driven models. If you have a rule-based approach, I will strongly recommend follow the rule, follow the algorithm. Don't spend your time on data-driven approach. When do these methods shine? They shine when we have complex systems, systems that are heterogeneous, systems that are emergent. Emergent in the sense when you combine 2 or 3 components, that leads to a very new type of behavior, right? So if you look at a bicycle, when you start assembling the handle, the wheel, the pedal, all of a sudden you can move. So that's an emergent property. And then when you have hidden behavior, these are four things that you look for when you try to see whether your problem, your system is suited for machine learning or not. Now, the third one to me is very, very important. Initially, when I was spending time on data-driven modeling, I didn't pay a lot of attention on the third requirement. So the third requirement is you need multimodal sources. So what is a multimodal source? For example, when I'm talking to you, I'm using my hand gestures, I'm using my expression, I'm using my voice. This is multimodal. I'm using a lot of different modes of communicating. So if you have just one type of source, let's say a pressure measurement, then I don't think machine learning are really suited for it. But when you have multimodal sources that are generating large volumes of data, especially unstructured data, and they're generating at a very high rate. So this four combination in the subsurface world is relatively rare. But when we do DAS, DTS, these things, the DAS, DTS data kind of becomes more closer to these requirements. And finally, I use data-driven methods, machine learning, to discover new knowledge to handle complexity. With that, I'll move forward. These are some of the use cases that I have seen. But again, it is not limited to these use cases, but these are some popular use cases that I've seen commercial applications in. So the first one is when you want to automate mundane in the sense boring, or day-to-day kind of stuff, mundane, repetitive, low-risk task, you need some ML approach. And one very good example is depth shifting of well logs. So if you don't shift that well logs, your interpretation will be wrong. You need to depth shift. It's a mundane, repetitive, low-risk task. So might as well automate it. And machine learning, through data, it can learn how to automate that process. If you want to build a model that continuously updates, an example would be a reservoir model that is continuously updating with pressure and rate data. You need ML techniques. If you want to detect minute patterns, let's say you want to detect presence of fractures or propagation of a fracture. So for minute patterns in a high dimensional data set, you need these techniques. Example would be when you analyze microseismic data. Now, precision engineering. What I mean by that is you have a wellbore, you want to perform a very specific type of engineering operation at a specific depth. So anytime you want precision, for example, when you do formation testing is when you are uh, sucking out fluids from a particular depth using a device called formation tester. So how much of fluids should you inject or should you suck out? How long should you wait is a very precision oriented task. So you need precision in that because your precision will define your interpretation. So for those kind of tasks, you need machine learning. With that, I will encourage all those who are here today to look at these two open archive papers. These are available for public consumption. You don't need to pay anything. So one is machine learning assisted exploration and production. It's a review paper. We have looked into how ML is used for different subsurface energy applications. What I mean by that is hydrocarbon geothermal and for carbon geosequestration as well. The other one is where I have uh, another way of looking at the same things, different set of reviews. This is published in the Circular Economy and Sustainability. It's a slightly broader compared to the first one, which is very specific to all that different applications. I have two books on these topics. One is Machine Learning for Subsurface Characterization. It's 2019 published. In the ML world, 2 years is a long time. Um, so when I published, it was 2019, which means all the work was done in 2018 and then it got published in 2019. So I'm working on the third book, which is more about coding and the codes. But if you are interested, you can look into this, but it's 2019. And this is the latest one, which is all about electromagnetic data interpretation. So with that, let me jump into the first case study. Once I end the first case study, we can have a discussion on whatever I've discussed so far. So this is all about geomechanical predictions by processing CT scan data. What you see here is a CT scan device. There is a whole core sample. This whole core sample is put into the CT scan and we generate density image. A CT scan measures density, high density, low density at different energy levels. And from there, we can see the matrix distribution. We can see pore distribution depending upon the resolution of the device. The objective here is, can we take these CT scan images, which is in 3D? What you see here are two orientations, but this data is in 3D. Can we take this 3D volume data and try to generate some of these properties? Now, let me first talk about the features or the starting inputs. So the input is the CT scan data. It is a very high resolution image because you can perform it in the lab. The resolution is there's one slice or there's one 2D image available every 0.002 feet. So pretty high resolution. Just this image of 90 feet long core had a size of around 30 GB. So it's a 30 GB data set that we worked with. Now, if we look at what we are trying to predict, we are trying to predict some of these properties that have been derived from well logs. So this is the target. These properties are derived from various different well logs in the same interval from where this core is taken. The target it as a low resolution. So let's say if you build a model that can relate the feature to the target, how can you use it? You can use this model then to improve the resolution of the target if you want, or what you can do is you don't need to perform well log operation in the subsurface. All you need to do is bring the core samples and then try to predict these properties in the subsurface. So these are two applications of this supervised learning approach. We're trying to relate the feature to the target. Once we do that, we can use it for upscaling the well logs, or we can use it to generate all these different well log properties in other wells where we don't have well logs, but we have the core slab data. This was this particular project was funded by a service company. So let me go ahead. If I look at a 0.5 feet depth interval of this core data is 90 feet. If I look at one zone, which is 0.5 feet, it has 250 slices. Some of the slices are pretty good. Some of the slices are broken. There were 11,000 samples or 11,000 samples that were broken out of 44,000. So we developed a method to quickly detect all these different broken slices and remove them from analysis. We cannot do much of these analysis on the broken samples. We need a particular amount of information in each slice to do anything meaningful. So let's say we have 30,000 slices in this 90 feet interval. First, what we did is we performed feature extraction, because without feature extraction, all we have is CT number. These CT numbers are approximation of densities. We have CT scans at two different energy levels. They see slightly different properties of the CT scan. So we integrated these two different types of energy and all the pixels or all the CT numbers for each slice. And we started extracting features to do our task. So kind of features you're looking at is Sobel, Hessian, Wavelet, and local binary pattern. Sobel is an edge detector. It detects odd edges in the sense, if you have a, let's say, white surface and a, let's say, a brown surface, then it's an odd edge. Now, if you look at a Hessian, it is looking at even edges. Even edges as in you have a white surface and two different similar surfaces on both the sides. So Hessian detects local structures. It locates blobs. It can detect presence of elliptical or circular structures in the image. So Hessian is a even edge detector. Sobel is an odd edge detector. Wavelet, most of you are aware of wavelets. Wavelets are very common in the geophysical world. You're looking at the rate of change of a particular thing. You're trying to quantify the rate of change at different scales. That's what you're doing when you use Wavelet. You can apply Wavelet and get information in uh, different directions, horizontal, diagonal, and so on. Now, the final one is local binary pattern. This may be a little bit new to some of you. Local binary pattern is a texture detector. It is detecting texture. And how does it do it? By comparing a central pixel with its neighboring pixel. Let me show you a use case of local binary pattern. Let's say you have an image to begin with, which is very plain. It's a human face. It's a plain image. It's a grayscale image. By applying LBP, you can assign the texture value. So it is looking at how is this point different from its neighbors. You can look at texture at different scales. So sometimes these LBP properties become very important anytime you're trying to look at the textures. Now, if you look at Bayesian, which is a uh, even edge detector, which can detect local structures, you can see that some of these local structures and their edges are being detected, and you can apply Bayesian at different directions, XX, XY, and YY. So with that, let me tell you where we have reached. We have the CT scan image. We performed a lot of pre-processing. I've not shown you all the pre-processing steps. I just showed you that we removed some of these broken samples, but there is a lot of pre-processing that is done. Once you are comfortable with your pre-processing, you will perform feature extraction. And I'm performing feature extraction one zone at a time. And a zone is a 0.5 feet interval of this core slab. So we are taking 250 slices in this 0.5 feet interval, and we are extracting features by looking at the 3D distributions in both X, Y, and Z. So once we reach this step, then there's something interesting that we need to do, which is when we apply these feature extraction, what you look over here at the top is all these different features that we are extracting. It's a lot of information for each of the zones, which is 0.5 feet. So because it's a lot of information, we need a way to compress that information. So what I have done is I have used a relatively simple approach, which is for each zone, I'm looking at the histogram of each feature. So let's say this is a histogram of, I don't remember what it is, but let's say it's a Haitian XY feature. So this is a histogram. We look at histograms all across the different zones. We select some bands. So we select some bands, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Different features will have different bands. And for each of these bands, we are extracting some statistical parameters. So let's say for this particular feature, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bands. For 6 bands, we extract 6 features. So 36 features are generated for this particular feature extraction method. So if we count everything, we have 55 feature per zone that represent the distribution of the pixel intensity, 57 for Sobel, 36 for LBP, 33 for Wavelet, 33 for Haitian. In total, we have 214 feature for each zone, and we have 90 such zones in this CT scan data. 214 features is a lot. Anytime you have so many features and you want to use simple data-driven models, you have to perform uh, more feature reduction. You have to perform dimensionality reduction. So we perform dimensionality reduction in 3 steps. First is we remove features that are not correlated with the targets. So out of these 214 features, which of them don't have strong association with the target, we remove them. And all these pre-processing, dimensionality reduction needs to be done only on the training data. So that's the problem that I've seen in most of the publications. And that's what I did long time back. Initially, this is a mistake, which is you cannot do any pre-processing on the testing data. Testing data is something very sacred. You will keep it separate. All your pre-processing, dimensionality reduction, everything that you do has to be done on training. And then you redo everything on the testing using all the parameters you learn from training in order to figure out whether you have deployed your methods properly or not. So this is a very important concept. We cannot let information leak between training and testing. So when we do this dimensionality reduction, we looked at the training data. From 214, we ended up with 119, which are strongly associated with the target in the training data set. Then we removed highly correlated features. So I shouldn't use the word correlated, I should use the word collinear. So features that are collinear, we remove them because collinear features make the model non-unique. So when we do that, we are left with 57. And finally, we remove features that don't have enough variance or they don't contribute to the variance in the data. So we have applied PCA in the third step, and we obtain 29 features at the end. So we use these 29 features for purposes of prediction. Once we predict, we have to figure out what's the right metric to evaluate the predictive power of your model. A lot of people use MAE, mean absolute error, but mean absolute error has a problem. If your target that you want to predict has a lot of small values and a lot of large values, MAE will be biased towards large values because in large values, you will tend to have larger errors. For small values, your errors will be smaller. For example, permeability. Permeability shows a very big range. Resistivity shows a very big range. It's a logarithmic range. So for those kind of things, definitely you need to do scaling of the permeability or the resistivity. But when it comes to the metric, maybe just using MAE, mean absolute error, is not a good idea. So you have to look at MAE divided by range, MAE in the form of absolute percentage error, which is MAPE. MAPE has a problem, which is anytime your target is close to 0, MAPE will become infinite. So this is a problem. All these problems. So each metric has its own problem. Be aware of those problems and use the methods accordingly. So these are some predictions for Poisson's ratio, effective porosity, rho B, permeability, and the uniaxial compressive strength. If you look at MAPE, let's look at MAE divided by range. 11%, 13%, 13%. We cannot do much for permeability. This is a density distribution CT scan. So we cannot derive permeability, and this is what we are seeing for permeability. We are seeing a large error, and we are seeing a huge error for uniaxial compressive strength. But when it comes to trying to predict the well-log measured rho B, effective porosity, Poisson's ratio, our errors are relatively small. And all this work that I've shown you is only on one core slab or 190 feet. In the real world, when this project was shaping up, we have more data to work with, but I have only permission to show limited, the performance on limited amount of data. But the promise here is with more data, without knowing the first order relationship, these data-driven models can explore and they can try to figure out the right relationship. And we are seeing a decent performance, which can be improved further. This is the performance on different splits of the data. This is something that needs to be tested to see how the data or how the model operates when you change the statistical distribution on which it has learned and on which it is being tested. So what the main takeaway here is for these different splits, the MAE or the MAPE is relatively the same. We are looking at predictions of Poisson's ratio, which means our model is showing a good generalization irrespective of the statistical distribution it learns from and on which it is tested. So this is the first case study. I'll stop here. I'll take some time to breathe and I will let you ask some questions. If you have any, please feel free to unmute and I can answer.
I have a question, Dr. Misra.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So did you also try any transformations on the input features, or like during feature engineering, did you try any to see if the model can improve further or not?
Yes. So the four features that I'm showing, or the five, so pixel intensity is the CT number. And then we have these four, but we have tried a lot of different combinations. We tried a lot of different feature extraction methods and a lot of different ways of compressing the feature histogram into some numbers that we can work with. So out of all this, these are the 214 features that are showing good potential. But then one thing I would like to mention is we didn't stop at 214, we reduced it further. And by the time we reached at 29, this is principal component analysis, which means you have now combined all these relevant features into something that is in the mathematical world, right? So this 29 feature is a linear combination of all your starting features. These 29 features at the end don't have any physical meaning. They are in this mathematical world. Okay, so one thing that I would like to add to that particular question is all the work that I'm showing is on CT numbers. But then the other approach would be those of you who are coming from the CT scan world, there are ways in which these CT scan data that you see here, these CT numbers can be taken, and then you can uh, extract how much of it is quartz, how much of it is uh, let's say calcite. So you can do these types of calculation, weight percentage of different mineral distribution in these images. For that, you need inversion module. It is proprietary with the company that I worked with. So they generated some features using those inversion modules, which is reflective of the mineral composition. And those types of feature, they work even better for purposes of predicting phi E, Poisson's ratio, and so on, which I have not shown in this particular set of slide. Features are very important.
Okay, so this is Mrinal. I have a quick question.
Yes, Mr. Mina.
So, you have certain features that you got out of your CT scan data, and then you're relating those to, say, your 5 or 6 target variables, right? Now, the question is there any way to figure out which feature is affecting which target the most significantly?
So there's a way to do that, and I used to use that particular approach. I'll explain more on that. So I used to do that, but I've stopped doing it, and I'll tell you the reason. So so let's say we have these slabs. We extracted 214 features. We reduced it to 29, let's say. Why 29? Because with these 29 features, we'll have more unique model, right? So now the question is, which of these 29 features are important for this particular prediction? So for that, we have two approaches that are very popular. One is what I have been using a lot, which is called perturbation, uh, perturbation importance ranking, something like that. Perturbation importance ranking. It's a open source package. We can use it. I think the code is called ELI5. Maybe they have a new version, perturbation importance ranking. So what it does is it takes one feature at a time. It will randomize the feature, and then it will see the drop in the performance of the trained model. So you have a trained model which has learned from the original feature. It will take one of the features, it will randomize it, and then it will see the drop in performance. A feature which, when randomized, leads to the biggest drop, that feature is considered uh, more important. So this is what I used to do long time back. This is called feature ranking. And for feature ranking, there are different packages, and I used to use perturbation importance ranking. But I've stopped doing it because what I figured out is all these So the data-driven model to begin with is a correlation. And then on top of that, when you use such feature importance methods, you're again um, looking at correlation, right? So over the last 1.5 years, what I've started doing is I've started using causal discovery techniques. So we can talk about some of these packages later, but using these causal discovery techniques, what we can then do is we can explain that, okay, we have figured out this data-driven model. We have established the relationship between features and target. And then when we perform these causal discovery, we are seeing a strong causal relationship between some of these features and the target. So from my point of view, this is more meaningful and it assigns a more physics based foundation to the entire approach.
Okay, sort of, when I look at these supervised learning approaches, I kind of think in terms of inverse problems. So what you have at the end after training is essentially a nonlinear function that relates your model parameters to your target variables, right? So in inverse theory, we would typically look at how each of these parameters would affect my target data. And that way we can make more sort of intelligent inference about the system altogether.
Yes.
So in any case, I think what you told me is sort of along the similar line, but I'm not still
Yeah.
sure if that.
So if we
Yes.
want to do sensitivity analysis, recently I came across this work which they call design of experiments. And I'll go deeper into that. I've not found time, but I think there's a lot of promise in design of experiment approach, uh, which seemed very close to what we do in the sensitivity analysis world. And as I mentioned, for me, I'm trying to use causal discovery approaches, which means I'm creating a control a control data set and a treatment data set. And I'm trying to explore which of these features can explain the causality of the model.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree with you that there are a lot of different ways of looking at which of
Mhm.
these features are important and then explaining it.
So one quick comment, because I'd let others start, is that we also do similar things in seismic problems. Like we take the seismic traces and we come up with different what we call attributes. But this is just like intensity map, seismic amplitude. So why should those attributes or would help me to estimate additional parameters? There is some physics to it, but a lot of times we don't know the physics of the problems. So that's why I was asking you this question. So this is just a comment and nothing else. Thank you, though. It's a very interesting work.
Thank you, Professor Minal.
See,
I'll move
see,
into,
see a
yeah,
question
please.
on the chat from Sasi saying, which hyperparameter tuning method did you use? And what method did you use to detect a multi-collinearity?
Okay, so maybe I'll answer that later on. At this moment, I don't recall it on the top of my head. This work is a little old, so sorry for that. I don't have an answer right now. I'll just move ahead with the second case study. Let me go ahead. And I'll definitely answer that question from Sashi, but maybe towards the end. So this is fracture characterization using manifold approximation method. So we are moving from CT scan world to something more realistic. The data set has been acquired in North Dakota, I think. Let me just confirm. South Dakota. It's a EGS collab test bed, so enhanced geothermal system. This is the main objective. You want to have a lot of fractures in the subsurface in a, let's say, a granite or a basement rock, which is hot. You want to inject water. The water, I hope all of you see the screen. Yes. So the water will travel through these fractures. There'll be a high contact between the rock and the water will get heated up and it will start producing. So this is the objective. You need to have a lot of fractures in an enhanced geothermal system. So this work is a approach towards better understanding these fractures that we are creating in the subsurface. It's a intermediate scale experiment which was done in South Dakota. The system is designed at 1500-meter depth, so it is not realistic. It is at least somewhere close to the real world. There is a injector, and the distance between injector and the producer, if I remember correctly, is close to 90 meters. And injection is done at this red spot over here. Later on, injections were done at other spots, but today's work that I'll show you is the result of the injections that were performed here. There are monitoring wells. There are 6 monitoring wells. These monitoring wells have accelerometer data and hydrophones. Now, the analysis that I'll show you today focuses on the 3D accelerations that were recorded when injection was done at this spot. Injection was done in 3 days. Let me show you those numbers. Day 1 injection was just a check. 2.2 liters of fluids were injected. 815 triggers were located. And out of those, 817 triggers were detected. And out of those, 37 were located. Day 2, 23 liters were injected at the same spot, which means you are trying to elongate these fractures. 4,700 triggers were detected. Out of those, 99 were located. Day 3, the propagation of the fracture was done such that you propagate it further from injection to the producer. It was done at a pretty high rate, a lot of triggers, and 280 events were located. Now, a lot of different types of data were measured, but the data that I'm looking at is the 3D accelerations. And I'm showing you some snapshots of accelerations for each of those triggers. The triggers that you see here were detected by us. The events that were located were done by the collaborator. So we have no role in locating these events, and all these injections and the measurements, the data acquisition was done by Lawrence Berkeley. Now, as I mentioned, my focus is these 3D accelerations. For each trigger, I'm looking at 8 microseconds of the data. And I did a mistake in the symbol. And for those accelerations, there were 8,000 points. So for each of them, there were 8,000 points that were, okay, I think I did a mistake. There is 8 seconds of data for each trigger. And we have 8,000 time steps that we are measuring for each of these triggers. Now, we cannot work with 8,000 time steps for each trigger. It's a very big, high dimensional data set. Anything that we do with 8,000 dimensions or 8,000 features will lead to non-unique models. So the first thing is how to compress this data. Why are we doing this work? So in this work, we are using unsupervised method. Our objective is to map the fractures properly, if possible, see how the fracture is growing. And if we use unsupervised approach, the hypothesis here is we can use higher signal information. Just a second, I think there's some noise from my background, which is distracting. Just a second, give me a minute. Okay, I hope all of you can hear me now. Uh, so the use of unsupervised learning will help us use the whole data set. That's the objective of this work. Instead of looking at just the travel time or some limited information in terms of moment tensor, we want to use the whole signal to begin with. So these are some randomly sampled 3D accelerations that you see. Each of them have 8,000 data points, which is describing the motion. There is an early motion. So the early motions are bluer in the color. And as the motion slows down, it becomes hotter and redder. So what we figured out is using a frequency-based analysis or statistical analysis didn't lead us to any good performance. So what we ended up doing is we started using some physics-informed feature. So what I mean by physics-informed feature is that these motions have some elliptical nature. They can be enveloped in an ellipsoid. So we can then extract features like azimuth, incidence, rectilinearity, and planarity. I have a paper that I can refer to, those of you are interested. It's a pretty old paper, but what it's trying to do is it's trying to perform singular value decomposition on the covariance matrix of these three component signal data, and then extract the eigenvectors and eigenvalues. And from there, uh, they are extracting azimuth, incidence, rectilinearity, and planarity, which is trying to describe the elliptical or the ellipsoidal nature of these motions. We have divided these motions into 4 time bands. Each time band has its own ellipsoidal behavior. For each of these time bands, we're extracting 4 of these features. So what we have done is we have compressed the information from 8,000 data points for each trigger to 16 features for each trigger. Now, we have 16-dimensional data right now. We cannot do much with these 16-dimensional data. We are trying to perform unsupervised learning. So we have to find a way to visualize this data. So what we do next is we apply manifold approximation methods. There are two popular manifold approximation methods these days. One is called UMAP, which we have used, and the other is TSNE, T-S-N-E. So I'll just try to explain UMAP for those of you who are new to UMAP. We are performing manifold approximation, which can be thought of as a dimensionality reduction. But the main objective of manifold approximation is to preserve the topology of the data and help us visualize the data. So let's say we have a 3D data. We have 3D distribution of data. This is the side view over here. And then we have the front view over here. You can see an elephant. The legs are in black. The trunk, the tusk is in yellow. The legs over here are in blue. When we apply UMAP, the beauty is it condenses or compresses the information into 2D, let's say, and it preserves the topology. So all the data points belonging to the tusk, they are close to each other. They are on one side of this visualization. The leg is on the other side. The other legs are on the other side. So this is a very nice way of preserving the topology. So how does manifold approximation when we use UMAP work? So the first thing is it creates a graph structure in the high dimensional data set. So based on the number of neighbors you allow it to look at, it will create a graph structure in the high dimensional data. It will try to connect a certain group of data with the other group. It creates that graph. And then it tries to perform an optimization in a lower dimension to represent the same graph that was created in a high dimension. So the math is slightly intricate. I have not developed this method. I'm using this method, but I think UMAP has a lot of power. Those of you who are interested can look into this link that I've provided at the bottom. So as I mentioned, UMAP and TSNE, they are popular manifold approximation methods. I'm not using t-SNE here because t-SNE, no matter what I do, is not letting me see groups in the data. I'm using unsupervised method. I need to see my data better. But with UMAP, I start seeing groups. We have tuned the hyperparameters of UMAP, which means we have tried a lot of different combination of hyperparameters. And what we figured out is no matter what we do, we always end up seeing some of these groups in this visualization. So we have taken our trigger data, which is 8,000 data points. We have converted into 16 dimensional, and then we are converting into 3-dimensional UMAP representation. All the electronic noise goes to one side in this particular visualization. So once we generate these groups, the beauty is now we can start seeing how these different groups evolve in the physical domain. Remember, we have 800 triggers in day one. Out of those 800 triggers, 37 have locations. We didn't define the locations, but what we are doing is we are assigning colors to these locations. So now we can see how these different triggers are evolving in time and in different directions in the physical world. So the more locations we have, the better mapping we can do by using this approach. So the most important thing here is we are able to obtain these groups, which helps us visualize. Now, the big question is, should you trust these groups? So what these groups are indicating is the fracture property over here. The signals that are produced by fractures here are different from signals that are produced from fractures here, from here, and so on. So should you trust these groups? For that, what we did is I have some validation, which I'll show you after this slide. But this is again showing the visualizations we can obtain. So for example, when we perform this thing, we figured out that the C1 cluster and the C3 cluster, they are close to 180 degree from each other. They're close to 180 degree from each other. There's a C2 cluster which doesn't go anywhere, and there's a C4 cluster that starts moving along the length of the wellbore. All the signals that are produced by C4, they have similar properties. That's why they ended up in one group in this UMAP visualization. So should you trust these results? Now, Lawrence Berkeley generated fracture IDs for some of these locations. So once they generated the locations, they assigned fracture IDs to these locations. We didn't do it. When we put these fracture IDs, what we see is that different fracture IDs belong to the different set of groups that we have created in the UMAP space. Now, this is day one data. In day one data, what we are claiming is that these two groups were separate. Lawrence Berkeley, the fracture IDs were obtained after 3 days of stimulation. So after 3 days of stimulation, these groups, they must have gotten connected. So that's why they have the same fracture ID. We looked at day 3, day 2 data, and we are seeing the same thing over and over again. Different groups are generated and different groups have different fracture IDs on them, which means these groups have something to tell about the fracture networks that are being produced in the subsurface as we are stimulating. So that's end of case study 2. And I think I've reached, the time right now is 9:57. So we can have some question and answers right now. And if some of you want to hear more, I can talk about case study 3, which is not, it won't take that long of a time. So if most of you have time, we can talk about case studies 3, or else we'll stop here after the Q&A. So if some of you have questions, please ask me. I can answer you.
I have a comment, Dr. Misra. In this experiment, were you, could I say that you were essentially trying to replicate what traditional earthquake seismologists will do to find the source parameters of events that have happened? Because the first set of diagrams where you had the accelerometer information and the elliptical looking patterns, to me it seemed like that's kind of particle motion derivations. And the reason you do not see a pronounced elliptical pattern in any one direction is probably because of the inherent noise in the data that you have, which in your classification scheme, you later tried to separate and then created the clusters. And so in the earthquake world, those would then translate to relating the event back to the source, and based on the source parameters, classifying the events, which probably what the FRAC ID people have done using moment tensors. Is that a fair statement?
As in, I completely agree that this particular work is inspired by how we try to look at the earthquake information. But as in, you kind of noted each and everything pretty correctly, but I just want to add something to it, which is we have this stimulation data. When we apply statistical techniques on the motions, or when we apply frequency-based analysis of these motions, it didn't lead to these clusters. So so what is important is these clusters. This is not supervised learning, which means we don't know what these clusters are right now. These clusters are being generated based on unsupervised approach. But to see these clusters, we used UMAP, and UMAP helped us separate these different clusters, and then we started describing the meaning. When we apply frequency-based features, when we apply statistical-based features, we were not able to generate such clusters. What we ended up is mostly groups, no matter what we tried. So I think the most important takeaway here is when we have these 3D accelerations, using some of these techniques where we can look at the ellipsoidal nature of these motions can help us detect the different fracture networks that are present as you're stimulating. One thing that I would mention is in this experiment, which was done at an intermediate scale, the biggest problem was that the acquisition or the resonance frequency of our acquisition was very close to the signal frequency range that we are interested in. So that led to a little bit of uh, uh, corruption or a little bit of low signal to noise ratio. But maybe if we have a better signal to noise ratio, or let's say when we do this thing in a real world, there will be a much better separation of the signal frequency and the resonance frequency.
Yeah.
But I completely agree with the way you kind of summarized. But here we have not used any classification. It's purely unsupervised. And we are not applying unsupervised right away, in the sense we are not performing k-means or let's say agglomerative clustering right at the start. What we are doing is we are performing step-by-step feature engineering, feature extraction to see such separation. And once we see such separations, we then try to figure out what's happening. And the way of validating these groups is looking at these things in the physical world and then trying to relate them with the fracture IDs that were assigned by some other group.
Yeah.
Adhanga here. Questions about talking about the data processing and the dimensional reduction efforts. Do we really need those? It seems like that is a key part of main parts of the workflows. I mean, if we are asking machine to find the trends and the features, do we really need to clean up all the noise that we think is a noise and we think is not the right data? Do we not want to keep all and let the machine look for the trends and patterns?
Yeah.
Why
so
we need to process the data?
Yeah. So in this case, I'll just give you an example in this particular case, right? Why do we need any feature extraction? And I emphasize a lot on feature extraction. For me, feature extraction is the most important thing. So the question is why, right? So let's say we want to use all this information that is there for each trigger. So what you're seeing is for each trigger, we have all these 8 milliseconds of data. So I'm correcting myself. It's 8 milliseconds of data, not microseconds, not 8 seconds. It's 8 milliseconds of data. These 8 milliseconds of data have 8,000 data points each. So if we don't perform feature extraction, if we don't perform any compression of these high dimensional data set, what will happen is any data-driven model that we build will be non-unique. It will be overfitting. It is very easy to differentiate groups in a high dimensional space, but whatever you do in a high dimensional space will not generalize well, because for the same variations, you have 1,000 different boundaries, you have 1,000 different solutions. So the way to make your model more unique, to reduce the variance of a model, we need very strong feature extraction. And that's why we need to remove noise from the data.
I mean, I haven't done too much of the machine learning project, but I feel like there's too much bias if I do processing, or if I do feature extraction, or reduce the dimensionality, because people are looking for multiple dimension, more ways of looking at the same features. So why do we have to put our own bias? But probably you have been trying it, so you know why it's done. But if machine learning is really being magical effort, we should not put our own biases.
Yeah, so a great question. And I'll just say this thing, that machine learning on its own is really useless, right? If we just rely completely on machine learning, we need human intervention, we need human knowledge, we need a very strong physical foundation, or else, to be very frank, machine learning will not lead to anything. And that's my experience. The way I have been using machine learning mostly, that all these things that I've shown you today, is statistics on steroids, or statistics in a higher dimension, right? At the end, everything here are statistical correlations. And for statistics to work well, we need to ensure that we don't have too many dimensions to work with. If we have too many dimensions, our models will be non-unique. They will have a lot of variance. But I agree to what you're saying, that if machine learning is magical, but again, machine learning cannot be magical if we don't design good features. One quick thing for those of you who may be relatively new to neural networks, my understanding of neural networks is they can do a lot of interesting things. For neural networks, you don't need feature extraction, but you need a lot of data. How many data points? So let's say for a very simple neural network to work well without any feature extraction, you need at least, let's say, 100,000 samples to begin with. As your task becomes more and more complex, you will need more and more data for these neural networks to extract the features. So yes, neural networks are magical if we have a lot of data to work with. In the engineering world, we don't have a lot of data. Because we don't have a lot of data, we cannot use neural networks. So what we have to do is we have to be very clever to create good features which are inspired by the physics, or which have strong mathematical foundation, and then develop simpler data-driven approaches to solve our task. So that has been my approach so far.
So I still see the questions from Sasi. If you now want to respond to him, Sasi, if you want to ask, please unmute and ask your questions.
So Sashi asked hyperparameter tuning. Sashi, if you're there, can you please explain? I understand what you mean by hyperparameter tuning, but I just want to know why you're interested in that question, because to me, there are three ways of doing hyperparameter tuning. One is called a random grid search. That's one. Number two is what I do, which is a grid search, which is not random, which means I define the grids to look at, I define the combinations to look at. And then there is a third way of doing hyperparameter tuning, which is called optimized grid search, where As you go closer and closer to the right combination of hyperparameters, you start zooming into that region and you start using gradient descent optimization to reach to the right set of hyperparameters. So for example, here, the best performing models for, let's say, let's just look at the top 3 because we got good performance for that. The best performing models are Elastic Net, which is like a linear regression model. It's a linear regression model with regularization. It has both L1 norm and L2 norm. Then we have Bayesian ridge regression. And then we have, again, Elastic Net. So for these 3, we have simple linear regression based methods. Yes, they have hyperparameters. Hyperparameters, they need to be tuned because they govern the learning. Without hyperparameter tuning, your learning will be very weak. And I have used grid search for hyperparameter tuning. I hope I answered Sashi's question.
Shashi is not with us
anymore.
Yeah.
So we have touched almost 10, 9 a.m. So if there are any questions, we can discuss that, or if you recommend anything, we can do that. Up to you, how you want to take this discussion forward.
If there are no more questions, then I don't know. I think we can have your third use case also. That would be interesting to see. Yeah.
So if
we don't get to see so many people, and this is a new field for at least me and many of us here. So it will be interesting to see where it is being used and how it is. You are the expert, so it would be nice to have that.
So
let me ask you one more question, Steve. Probably you want to talk about the geophysical data. So mostly we are most of us are looking at the geophysical data, mostly seismic, sometimes the other EM or other data. So we do have the quantity of the data. We may not have the dimensionality of the data because the way we scan the Earth is only limited the way we record the data. And still, I still see people processing the data, whatever we have it has a volume, but it doesn't have all the variability of how we see, how we scan the Earth. So we still see people doing a lot of effort in the processing and dimensional reductions and all kinds of processing. So in the seismic world, if you have any experience playing with it, and how do you see the neural net or any of the machine learning methods making not a fracture prediction, but like reservoir property prediction, where you're looking at porosity, a form, or lithology, or the reservoir property for interest fluid, for example. Do you see that coming, or do you see it's not possible?
So I've seen a lot of work on fault detection, as you mentioned, right? So why is the fault detection work possible? Because there are experts like you who define these faults, and then people who develop machine learning algorithms, they try to relate the seismic data with these faults, and they're able to see that, right? So in terms of reservoir property characterization, if you have labels to begin with, which means if you have reservoir properties well defined in that whole reservoir, then only some reservoir property prediction is possible. Because what I've seen in industry right now is mostly people use supervised learning, and supervised learning is the one that has the highest commercial application right now. Unsupervised methods, they help perform exploratory data analysis, which doesn't have any strong commercial applications right now. It will be good for you as engineers and scientists as a tool, but not for commercial benefits. So we don't see a lot of unsupervised methods. Reinforcement learning is too, it's at the frontier. It's mostly about the control problem. So we don't see that either. So what we are left with supervised learning. For supervised learning, we need labels. A lot of people provided the fault labels, and that's why we are able to relate the X with Y. But other than that, if you want to predict reservoir property, somebody will relate the seismic to the well logs, and then you'll try to predict those well logs. But the biggest problem is the resolution difference, right? I think TGS, PGS, they are developing a lot of data-driven techniques because they have a lot of seismic in-house data as well as well logs. So they're trying to relate them. but it's a supervised approach. And
Recently, I've seen people making the synthetic models, and where you know the answer, and then you also create a synthetic seismic.
yeah,
You see if you can correlate the data, which is synthetics, to the real.
so you relate you perform well on synthetic data, and then you can
Yeah,
kind of
if it is
propose.
synthetic, you can create millions of pseudo wells,
Yeah.
and then you have the corresponding seismic response,
Mhm.
and you can train your.
Yeah.
Like, we have seen a lot of publications. I'm still not very comfortable, because I'm asking you, do you see it coming? Do you see it practical?
As long as the whole thing that I explained, I think to summarize in one line will be, it will come if there are good labels. Because mostly what we do is we use supervised learning. For supervised learning, we need good labels. So from your experience, if you think there's a task that has good labels or good targets, which is the Y, then we can relate any X to that Y. That's machine learning. It can relate any X to the Y, given that you have that Y. And that Y, which is the target, which is the label, is the biggest question. So if you think that there is a task, or there's a data set where we have very nice human or manually labeled targets, then that task can be solved. I hope, yeah, I hope I try to.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Anybody else wants to add any questions, comments? It's good to have the discussion, so we learn from each other. If not, then Sid, you can go ahead and do the third case study. Yeah. Thank you.
So Dhananjay, do people call you DJ? Am I correct? Right?
Yeah, DJ is fine. Yeah, anything.
Yes.
Kumar is
No.
fine.
Yeah. So because I have come across your name in a lot of different forums, but I think DJ is what you are referred as, right? So.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So I just want to add one thing to your comment, which when you were asking me a question, you said the seismic data doesn't have enough dimensionality, right? Because
Correct.
there's a
The way we acquire the
Yeah.
data, it has the. I mean, we are not measuring the whole waveform. We are measuring only the part of the response at the surface, and that too at very coarse locations. So it's not like we take a photograph and you can take a picture of something in a different orientation and different angles. That's not possible in our subsurface. We limited with how the source propagates through the to the subsurface and comes back. And even then, we are recording only part of those. That is what we scatter back to the surface. So we are not seeing the whole Earth in a big picture.
Yeah. So when you measure using those sensors, you are detecting amplitudes versus time, right?
Correct.
Right. So let's say you're measuring for some time, let's say 1 second, and in that 1 second, let's say you have some data points. So that is what makes your data high dimensional. So your raw data mostly is high dimensional because you are performing some measurement, no matter how many sensors you have. But if you have a measurement which is a function of time, it's already high dimensional data, because if you don't do anything with that raw data, you will have to work with that time interval, whatever that time interval is. So
the reason I'm going, that is probably not high dimension, that is probably high in the volume, in the number of data points.
Yeah.
But in terms of dimension, probably it's not high.
Yeah.
So my concern is if you have to process the data, for example, in the common seismic experiment, we record at least say 3 components. If you go to marine, sometimes you have 4 components. We end up using only small parts of data once we start processing the data and cleaning up that's 90% of the data is all gone. That's what we think is the noise. But if I'm asking machine learning tools, which is a numerical physics, to link the two, why do we have to process the data? And that's the train. I'm asking you, do we really need to process the data?
Yeah. And again, for example, we just had a miscommunication between the size, which is the volume of the data, and the dimension of the data, and that's very common, right? So I'll just tell you the machine learning perspective. So whenever I use data analytics, how I define the size and the volume and the dimension, and maybe that will help you better interact with some other, let me just, and again, I don't have an authority on these things, but this is what I've seen. So I just want to share, and I'm open for any suggestion or changes. So generally what we have is, let's say, no, I can't do this. Yeah, there's no way I can write it today. Okay, let me just try to.
Just create a new slide, and then you can probably write anything you want.
Yeah, this, okay, let me try it one last time. No. Okay, that's fine. I'll just explain.
No worry,
So
no worry.
yeah, from my machine learning side of things, the first thing I have is samples, right? I'm talking about supervised learning, which is the most commercial application. So I have samples. For each sample, I have some features and I have a target, right? I can have one target, I can have multiple targets. And then I have, let's say, 10,000 samples. So you can imagine each sample as a row in Excel sheet, and you have features, which is the column, and then you have a target, which is another column. So when we say the data set size is high, or when the volume of data is high, or that it's a big data, what we actually mean generally is this sample. So when we have a lot of samples, when we have a lot of rows in the data, to the best of my knowledge, that is what is called the size. Now, what is dimensionality in this approach? So our task is to relate the feature to the target for each sample. That's our main objective. So in this objective, the dimension is all these columns that we have. Now, for the raw data, generally the columns are, let's say in your geophysical world, when you're recording the waveform, it is the amplitude that is measured for each time step. So that will become the feature. And then you have a label for that waveform, let's say, and you will have multiple samples like that. So this raw data to begin with generally doesn't have any use case. So that needs to be kind of compressed. So let me just show you one slide here to make my point, because I just recollected that I have an example that I can show you. So in all my data-driven work, this is how I approach things. I first ask how many samples I have. So in this case study, I have 30,000 samples. I'll tell you what these samples are. So these are pixels. These are pixels in an image, which is a spatial data. So it can be applied on any spatial data. It can be applied to let's say a volume, a seismic volume if you want, because at the end, data is nothing but a matrix or an array. So I have 30,000 samples. Each sample is a pixel. For each pixel, I have extracted 16 features, which what I mean by that is I've looked at its neighbors. I've tried to define what should be the feature that is assigned to each of these samples. And then for each sample, I have a target. Okay, so this pixel is a pyrite, this pixel is kerogen, this pixel is pores, and so on. So in this arrangement, which I generally have, the number of samples is the size, the number of columns I have over here is the dimensionality, which is the number of features, and then we have the target. One thing we need to ensure is that there is a very low collinearity between the features, because if the features are collinear, then it will cause the model to be non-unique. Also, we need to ensure that we don't have noise in the feature, because if you have noise in the feature, your model will again become non-unique. It will have high variance. So we remove all the noise, we remove anything that doesn't have enough variance, we remove things that are collinear. So we are biasing the data, but the whole objective of biasing the data is to create a model that is more unique.
So from non-expert points of view, say the number of samples, for example, if you're measuring 2 millisecond sampling for the seismic, We are not interested from the top to bottom because that is not possible. Because otherwise, we'll have billions of model parameters that we cannot estimate from the data we have. So we are only looking for some information within the target of interest, which maybe say 10 hundreds of milliseconds, no more than that typically.
Yeah.
So in that case, the number of data becomes quite limited. And of course, even that data is biased by all the wave propagation from the top to the surface to the reservoir level. In terms of dimension, you can think of a seismic is if I take the same wiggle and if I create tens of or 16 different seismic attributes, you can think of that as 16 different dimensions. But
yeah,
most of them, they're going to be very similar. There are only few of those that can be very distinct.
yeah.
Okay, so in terms of the data samples are very, very many, but within the area of interest is only quite limited.
Yeah,
okay,
I agree.
because we are only measuring only the particular angle and particular part of the waveform. We are not measuring the full response of the subsurface. It is not possible. And the deeper you go, it becomes more difficult. And the data itself is biased by all the propagation effects from the surface all the way to the bottom and then come back. And we are not looking for imaging all the way because that becomes, billions of model parameter. So that's going to be impractical. Again, those who are doing neural net from the seismic perspective, they may have a better perspective than me talking from the conventional geophysics point of view.
So those of you who are here, I want to learn something from you.
Nanduri, I see Sriram and few more folks. I know that they have been working on the machine learning for a long time. So
yeah. So my question to some of you who may help me understand this thing better, which is, let's say I have all these acceleration data as a function. So what you're seeing here is X, Y, and Z, and then time is the color. But if I look at one acceleration in one direction, let's say the X direction, this is something that I get. And this is for one trigger, which is where I notice that some kind of a wave is coming. So my trigger detects it, and I have this information.
Yeah, so as Abhijit mentioned, we do look at the waveform, and the way it's a particle motion, or we call photogram plots, or any plots. We're looking at particle motions for different of those waves, and there, depending upon the orientation of those waves, you can find out if that's a P wave or shear wave. Yeah. Also, the other thing, you can compute the the mechanics of the wave propagation within the zones.
Yeah. So generally,
those
people
are quite standard, for the earthquake or seismology group.
So generally, people look at the P wave arrival and the S wave arrival, which is what a lot of people look at, right? And then you can derive moment tensors, right? It's by performing some inversion. Are there any other way in which some of you are using all this information?
That is more common in those who are looking for only to detect the event or from macroseismic, type data. But people are also looking at the whole, coda wave, the shape and the PS to S and all the multiple P to S conversions and all those, depending on how much detail you want to extract within data. And they are looking to exploit those as well to, learn about the more detail about the focal mechanism and about the causes of the earthquake. But most of the times, yes, you're right that we are only looking at the P and S wave, the first P and first shear wave time, because that is one that can find out the depth or the earthquakes. Yeah. But people are also looking at the full coda wave, from the P to S and all those conversion.
Yeah, I think that will require what do you call the full 3D inversion or something like that. In the machine learning side of things, how I approach when I come across such waveforms, which is being recorded, how I approach is I don't do the traditional way, which is where I try to detect P arrival, S arrival. Maybe if I do it, I'll get a better result. I have not tried that, but my easiest approach is let me look at the histograms of a lot of these waves as a function of time, and then define a band. So I generally, let's say, define a band here, and for this band, for this particular task, what I did is I looked at the motions for each band and then I extracted these features. And somehow these features turned out to be useful in the sense that I can see some groups emerging, which I was not able to see in any other approach. So again, I'm not trying to defend any work. Any data-driven work is a workflow. It needs to be tested. It needs to stand the test of time. It will change with more and more experimentation. But this is an approach that I use where instead of just looking at first arrivals or let's say a physics-based model, which has already been tried, I see how data can do the explaining. So when we do these bands and when we try to extract information, yes, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of unnecessary information that's there, but at the same time, maybe there is some interesting information that we capture. So that's what we are hoping for. Can we capture something interesting? And if it is something interesting, it will lead to a very high feature ranking, which Professor Minal asked. When we do feature ranking, if we find anything useful, that will stand out and it will tell us that, hey, this particular feature that you extracted has a lot of meaning or it has a lot of significance to the task that you're performing. So all this work that I generally do at the end, it ends up with trying to see the association or how important is the feature for that particular task. And different tasks lead to
in the
different
conventional
importance.
seismic model, I mean, because we want to minimize our model parameters, we want to find out which few parameters that has the most sensitivity to the data, and that's why we are trying to look for the sensitivity analysis that Dr. Sen was asking, and that we can do from any gradient type, or any sensitivity, methods that we know what 2 or 3 parameters are the most sensitive, and you look for those only. But now that
I think one comment here: are we mixing features and model parameters? Because I think they are different or not.
Yeah,
I mean,
so from a data analytics world, model parameters are the the model parameter is different, hyperparameter is different, and features are different. Yes, they're different.
Great, thank you.
In my talk, I have not used the word model parameter. I've used the word hyperparameter, but I've used a lot of the word feature. So these are 3 different things.
I think it
there's
is
too many.
10:30.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's 10:30, so I know it is very interesting and very nice presentation, which has excited. I think this is a talk which has really went well in the sense that it has excited so much of questions. I've never seen in our last 6 seminars so many questions. Thank you, Dr. Misra. I think in the interest of time and in everybody respecting everybody, most of the people have dropped now. So I'll request that we conclude unless there is one last question or some comments, Dr. Misra, you have for people like us. So I'm also trying to do something. So I have some DAS data. I'm trying to look at to identify different events, seismic events on the images. So I have no background in machine learning or anything, but it is 30 days of data and there are so many events. It is very difficult. It's sampled at 1 millisecond. So I'm looking at some frames of 10 seconds of data and I see some event somewhere and most of the frames don't have any events. So what would you recommend to me where I want to see which are my frames where I can pick with some machine learning, automated machine learning, that, yeah, these are the events and these are. So I have looked at the cat and dogs thing, which is available online, and we are having some success. So it is very good at identifying because most of the data is non-event. So it is very good at predicting, yeah, there is no event. But seeing the events is kind of hard because there is some noise and all that. So we are getting a lot of false positive, false negatives, that kind of thing. What would you recommend to me as a beginner, a novice in machine learning, where it can help me scan through my data and at least identify these are the events which I should be looking at in my, it's 1.5 terabyte of data. So it is 30 days of data.
Yeah, so in my unsupervised learning work that I showed you today, I had to detect events. And for detecting events, I used traditional geophysical techniques, which I kind of came across through a lot of different papers, which is look at the signal to noise ratio, look at some other properties, and if it satisfies that, that's an event. But if you want to use a data analytics way of identifying events or the triggers, what I would recommend is, let's say you put in a little bit of effort or hire an intern, ask that intern who is experienced to label to begin with. So if there's a particular type of signature that you see, this signature is this event. So that's what a lot of people do. They start with labeling. Labeling is, I think, the longest time in the data analytics workflow, cleaning and labeling. Once you do that, then this data-driven approach will help you relate the signatures to the label without you thinking what should be the physics, what should be the maths of performing that relationship. For me, for detecting triggers, I rely completely on whatever I come across in the geophysical papers or methods. But labeling may help.
Okay. Yeah, that is where we started. So we did for one day, we did some labeling for a couple of hours of the data. And yeah, that is what I was talking about. Then using, so labeled that these are the events and these are the non-events. So that's how we got a good starting point. Yeah, that is where we also started. Yeah, we labeled this is the event and this is non-event.
Yeah, but the biggest problem, the more I spend time in machine learning, what I realize is I have to look at the data as a statistical distribution, and I have to think that any model that I develop, for it to work, it has to see the whole statistical distribution of the process that you want to map, right? So maybe if you just create labels on the initial data, maybe it will never be able to detect the late data. So it's challenging in that sense that I'll go to what DJ said, which is yes, we will be putting a lot of bias in these models. It's magical, but a bias is needed. Without bias, these machine learning algorithms will not be able to see the statistical distribution of the process that we are interested in. Okay. And in this entire subsurface world, I think geophysicists are the people who are the closest to the machine learning applications. Why? Because of the kind of data you deal with, the volume of data that you deal with. Waveform is unstructured data. It has time series element as well. It has the depth-based features as well. So geophysics data kind of is very well aligned with what machine learning can deliver. Unlike, let's say, a well-logged data. Well-logged data is just depth-based. It doesn't have other features. If you look at the petroleum side, the production data, it is only time series. It is a decline generally. It doesn't satisfy all these requirements of machine learning, which is your process should be complex, your data should be unstructured, and so on. So all of you, I think, are the right people to start using these tools and bring about a change in how we do things.
Okay. I think, thank you so much. Yeah, we have crossed our time. I think it's over. Yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate your coming on, and thanks to Abhijit and thanks to you that you are here. And we really appreciate. We may have you learn more about your machine learning endeavors coming down. You are saying that you are already working on a new book. So it will be nice to have another talk sometime next year. And we'll learn more about what you are up to. And we wish you all the best. And thanks again.
Yes, Samarjit helped us coordinate all this discussion. So he has been pretty crucial in letting me know and following up with me for today's seminar. So thanks to Samarjit as well.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.